The morning they left smelled like wet asphalt and pine, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes long after you've driven away, and I remember thinking, as I stood on the porch, watching them load their backpacks into the trunk, that the air itself felt restless, as if it wanted to follow them into the mountains. Leela was laughing about something small, a joke I can't even recall now, her head tipped back, dark hair catching the pale light, while Mara checked her phone for the third time, thumb hovering over a message she didn't send, her smile thinner, more careful. They were so close in age people always thought they were twins, but anyone who knew them could see the difference in the way they moved through the world. Leela all impulse and warmth, Mara quieter, always carrying an extra layer of thought beneath her words, like she was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. They hugged me one after the other, backpacks knocking into my ribs, the fabric cold from the morning air, and Leela whispered that they'd be back before I even had time to miss them, that it was just a weekend, just a breath of freedom before life pulled them back into its usual shape. Mara held on a second longer, her hand tightening at the back of my jacket, and when she pulled away her eyes searched my face as if she wanted to say something else, something heavier, but instead she only told me to keep the porch light on, joking that it made the house look like it was waiting for them. I laughed and promised, not knowing how that small promise would come to matter. Their car rolled down the driveway, tires hissing over damp gravel, and for a moment the red of the brake lights glowed through the mist like two fading embers before the road swallowed them. I went back inside, made coffee I didn't really want, and told myself not to be dramatic, that sisters went on trips all the time and came back with stories and photos and dirt still clinging to their shoes. Still, I found myself standing at the window longer than usual, watching the trees sway, feeling a quiet tug in my chest I couldn't name. The Smoky Mountains had always been a place we talked about the way people talk about dreams, as something beautiful and a little unreal, a stretch of green and blue that promised space when the world felt too tight. Leela had been the one to push for it, scrolling through pictures late at night, pointing out waterfalls and trails with names that sounded like poetry, her voice full of that bright certainty that made you believe things would turn out exactly as she imagined. Mara had agreed more slowly, reading reviews, mapping routes, packing extra food and a first aid kit, the practical counterweight to Leela's fire. Together, they made it feel safe, balanced, like nothing could tip them too far in either direction. On the drive there, they played the same old playlist they'd grown up with, singing too loud to songs that had been worn soft by time, windows cracked just enough to let the cool air rush in and tangle their hair. Leela drummed on the dashboard, missing the beat half the time, while Mara navigated, calling out turns, occasionally smiling when Leela leaned over to steal sips from her coffee. They stopped at a diner just outside the park, the kind with cracked vinyl seats and a bell on the door that jingled when you walked in, and ordered pancakes they couldn't finish, laughing about how they'd burn it all off on the trails anyway. A waitress asked where they were headed, and when Leela said the Smokies, the woman nodded with a look that was half admiration, half something harder to read, telling them to be careful, that the mountains were beautiful, but they didn't give anything away for free. They took pictures in the parking lot, one of Leela pretending to wrestle with her oversized backpack, another of Mara squinting into the sun, hair pulled back, lips curved in a rare, unguarded smile. Those photos would end up meaning more than anyone could have guessed, frozen moments of light before everything tilted. By the time they reached the trailhead, fog was already creeping through the trees, thin and silver, curling around trunks like breath. The air smelled deeper there, richer, damp earth and moss, and something wild that made Leela inhale dramatically, spreading her arms as if she could gather it all into herself. Mara checked the map, adjusted her straps, and reminded her not to rush ahead, that the path could get tricky once they were deeper in. Leela only grinned and promised, though even then her boots were already crunching forward over fallen leaves. The first stretch was easy, wide enough for them to walk side by side, their voices echoing softly between the trees. They talked about everything and nothing, about work they were tired of, about dreams they hadn't quite dared to chase, about the way the world felt like it was moving faster than they were ready for. Mara mentioned, almost casually, that she'd been thinking about making a change, maybe leaving town, maybe finally doing something just for herself, and Leela bumped her shoulder, telling her she'd follow her anywhere, that sisters didn't let distance break them. Mara smiled at that, but her eyes drifted back to the path ahead, to the way it narrowed as it disappeared into shadow. As they climbed higher, the fog thickened, turning the forest into a maze of muted shapes and dripping leaves. The sounds of the world beyond faded until all that remained were their footsteps, their breathing, the occasional call of a bird somewhere above, unseen. Leela's laughter grew quieter, replaced by a kind of focused excitement, while Mara's caution sharpened, her gaze constantly scanning for trail markers, for any sign they were still on the right path. They passed a fallen log slick with moss, a stream that cut across the trail in a rush of cold, clear water, and for a moment they stopped, crouching to splash their faces, the chill making them gasp and laugh, the sound echoing strange and hollow in the fog. It was there, by that stream, that Mara pulled out her phone again, frowning at the lack of signal, at the little icon that refused to light up, and Leela teased her, telling her to let go, to pretend the world didn't exist beyond the trees, just for a while. Mara slipped the phone back into her pocket, but her fingers lingered there, as if she needed to feel its weight to stay anchored. They kept going, deeper now, the trail twisting, climbing, the forest closing in until the sky was only a pale suggestion above them. Leela moved ahead, her red jacket a bright thread in the grey-green world, while Mara followed a few steps behind, calling out when roots crossed the path, when stones shifted underfoot. The fog pressed closer, dampening sound, making the space between them feel longer than it was. At one point, Leela turned around, her face flushed, eyes shining, and said it felt like they were walking into another world. Like the mountains were swallowing them whole, and Mara told her not to say things like that, half laughing, half serious, because even jokes could make fear real if you let them. They reached a fork where the trails split, one path marked clearly, the other narrower, the sign partially hidden by a leaning branch. Leela stepped toward the smaller path, peering down it with curiosity, saying it looked more interesting, more like the pictures she'd seen, while Mara crouched to brush leaves away from the sign, trying to read what was left of the faded letters. The fog shifted then, thickening, and for a moment even the path they'd come from seemed to blur, as if the forest were rearranging itself while they weren't looking. Leela waited, bouncing lightly on her toes, excitement buzzing in her, while Mara stood, map in hand, eyes moving between paper and trees, her brow furrowed with the weight of choice, the simple, ordinary act of deciding which way to go feeling suddenly heavier than it should have. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridgeline that first night, their car was still sitting at the trailhead, a thin line of dust settling over the windshield like a quiet accusation, and that was when the waiting began, not with panic yet, just with a tightening in the chest that made every minute feel louder than the last. At home, the porch light glowed into the dark the way I had promised, a small circle of warmth against the widening night, and I kept glancing at the clock, telling myself they were probably still hiking, probably lost track of time, the way Leela always did when she was happy. But when midnight came and went, and my phone stayed stubbornly silent, that tightness spread until it felt like it was wrapping around my ribs. By morning, worry had grown teeth. Calls went unanswered, texts stacked up without a single reply, and when I drove to the park and saw their car exactly where it had been the day before, the fog still clinging to the trees like a second skin, something inside me finally broke open. Rangers moved with calm efficiency, radios crackling, voices low and steady, asking what they were wearing, where they were headed, how experienced they were. I answered automatically, the words spilling out as if I were reciting a story I'd heard before, not one I was suddenly living. Red jacket, dark hair, careful one, laughing one, sisters, just sisters who were supposed to come back. Search teams formed quickly, boots lacing, packs tightened, dogs straining at leashes, and soon the forest was filled with the sound of human presence, voices calling their names, branches snapping under hurried steps, whistles cutting through the damp air. I followed as far as they'd let me, standing at the edge of the trail, watching bright vests disappear into the grey-green world, feeling useless in a way I had never known before. The mountains that had seemed so beautiful in pictures now loomed like a wall, vast and unyielding, swallowing sound, hiding everything in their folds. Hours blurred into each other as we waited near the command post, the smell of wet earth mixing with the sharp scent of coffee from thermoses, the low hum of radios never quite stopping. Every time a voice crackled, my heart leaped, only to sink again when it was just another update, another area cleared, another stretch of trail with nothing but footprints already blurred by moisture and time. The fog lifted and fell in waves, sometimes thinning enough to show patches of blue sky, other times thickening until the trees looked like ghosts, their shapes shifting with every breath of wind. Their parents arrived by midday, faces pale, eyes wide with a fear that didn't yet have a name, and when their mother saw me, she gripped my hands so hard it hurt, asking what I knew, what I'd heard, as if I might be holding something back that could make this all less real. I told her everything, every small detail of that morning, the hugs, the jokes, the way Mara had lingered, and with every word her face crumpled a little more, until she pressed her forehead to mine and whispered their names like a prayer. The first night of searching ended without answers. Lights moved through the dark like distant stars, dogs barked somewhere far off, and then one by one the teams returned, muddy and exhausted, shaking their heads. We sat in folding chairs under tarp as rain began to fall again, soft at first, then harder, drumming on plastic and leaves, turning the ground into slick mud. No one said much. There was nothing to say that could make it better. When they finally told us to go home, that they'd start again at first light, it felt like being asked to leave part of ourselves behind in the woods. At home, the house was too quiet, every creak sounding like a footstep that wasn't there. Their mother sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, a mug growing cold in her hands, while their father paced from room to room, stopping now and then to look at the girls, photos on the wall, as if he could will them back through sheer force of love. I lay on the couch, phone on my chest, eyes open to the dark, jumping at every vibration, every imagined sound of tires on gravel, every whisper of wind against the porch light that still burned. Days turned into a strange rhythm of hope and exhaustion. Each morning brought fresh teams, more volunteers, people from nearby towns who had seen the news and decided to help, their faces a mix of determination and quiet dread. They searched trails and ravines, called into hollows, checked shelters and streams, marking maps with lines that slowly spread like cracks across glass. Helicopters thudded overhead, their noise rattling windows and nerves alike, while drones buzzed through gaps in the trees, eyes in the sky looking for any sign of red fabric, any movement that didn't belong to the forest itself. We waited by our phones, by radios, by anything that might carry news, clinging to rumors that flared and died just as quickly. Someone thought they'd heard voices near a ridge, but it turned out to be wind. A hiker reported seeing a red flash through the trees, but it was just a scrap of plastic caught on a branch. Each false lead cut deeper than the last, hope rising only to be crushed again, leaving behind a heavier, duller ache. Nights were the worst. When the search paused, when the forest went dark and quiet again, imagination filled the silence with every possible horror. Their mother couldn't sleep, wandering the house, touching their things, folding and unfolding clothes, as if keeping them busy might somehow keep the girls safe too. Their father sat on the porch for hours, staring into the dark beyond the light, listening for sounds that never came. I sat with him sometimes, neither of us speaking, the air between us thick with questions we were too afraid to ask. After a week, the tone shifted. The words people used grew heavier, more careful. Recovery started to replace rescue in conversations that were meant to be private, but weren't, not really, because grief has a way of leaking through walls. The search areas widened, then narrowed, then widened again, but nothing changed. No backpacks, no footprints that couldn't be explained, no sign that two young women had ever passed through those trees at all. It was as if the mountains had swallowed them whole and sealed themselves shut behind them. Media trucks arrived, their bright logos and cameras feeling obscene against the quiet pain of waiting. Reporters asked the same questions over and over, their voices soft, their eyes sharp, hunting for tears, for sound bites, for anything that could turn loss into a story. We answered because it felt like doing something, like refusing might somehow make the girls disappear even more. Their faces appeared on screens, smiles frozen in time, while strangers across the state learned their names and then moved on to the next headline. Weeks stretched into months, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the search thinned. Volunteers went back to their lives, teams scaled down, updates came less often. The command post was dismantled, the maps folded away, the radios quiet. When officials finally sat us down and told us they were suspending active efforts, that they'd follow any new leads but couldn't keep combing the mountains forever, it felt like being told to start mourning without a body, without a goodbye, without any proof that goodbye was even the right word. Life didn't stop, but it changed shape. The porch light stayed on every night, a stubborn little star against the dark, even when neighbors began to ask gently if maybe it was time to let it go. Their mother kept setting 2 extra plates at dinner, then pushing them away at the last moment, tears slipping into her napkin. Their father threw himself into work, coming home late, smelling of sweat and sawdust, collapsing into bed without a word. I kept my phone close, charging it by my pillow, jumping every time it buzzed, even when I knew deep down that the silence was becoming its own kind of answer. The mountains faded from the news, from conversations, from the way people spoke about them, but they never faded from our minds. In dreams, I saw fog rolling between trees, heard voices calling out names that echoed without reply, felt the cold, damp air on my skin as if I were standing there again, waiting. In waking moments, a car passing too slowly would make my heart race. A knock at the door would send a shock through my chest, and for a split second, I would believe it was them, muddy and tired, but alive, back to tell us it had all been some terrible mistake. But the door always opened to someone else, and the light on the porch always shone on emptiness, and the waiting stretched on, changing from sharp fear to a dull, constant ache that settled into the bones, teaching us, against our will, how to live with not knowing. Time did not heal us, it only learned how to move around the wound, and by the second year the house had settled into a quiet that felt less like peace and more like surrender. The porch light still burned, but now it flickered sometimes, as if even it were getting tired, and I would catch their mother staring at it through the window, her lips moving as though she were bargaining with something she could not see. Their father stopped packing and started sitting instead, long hours in the same chair, hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor, carrying his grief the way men do when they don't know where to put it. The world, of course, kept going. Seasons turned over the mountains that had swallowed Mara and Leela, leaves falling, snow burying trails, spring rain washing away whatever traces might once have been there. People asked less often. The casseroles stopped coming. Cards dried up. And slowly, painfully, we realized that to everyone else, the story was ending, even though for us it was still happening every single day. It was in the 3rd year that the calls began. At first they were small things, almost nothing. A woman in North Carolina swore she'd seen a girl who looked like Mara working at a diner off the highway. A trucker said he'd picked up a hitchhiker in Tennessee who had Leela's eyes. Each time, hope flared like a match struck in the dark, bright and burning, only to die just as quickly when photos didn't match, when timelines didn't fit, when faces were similar but not the ones we knew by heart. Still, we chased every lead, because not chasing felt like giving up, and giving up felt like killing them ourselves. Then came the voicemail. It was a Sunday afternoon, gray and slow, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. When I listened to it later, standing in the kitchen while the kettle screamed on the stove, I felt my knees go weak. The message was short, no more than a few seconds, but I knew that voice before my mind could catch up. It was Leela. Not her laugh, not her teasing tone, but her voice, thin and trembling, saying only my name just once, like she was afraid to say more. Then a soft sound, like breathing, and the call cut off. I replayed it until my hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The sound was distorted, fuzzy, but there was no mistaking it. I had heard that voice since childhood, through scraped knees and whispered secrets and late-night phone calls. It was hers. When I showed it to their parents, their mother covered her mouth to keep from crying out, while their father closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against the wall, breathing in slow, broken pulls. We took it to the police the same day, hearts pounding with a hope we were almost afraid to touch. They analyzed it, ran it through software, checked phone records, traced towers, but all they could tell us was that it had come from somewhere in the eastern part of the state, bounced through a prepaid phone that was already dead. Still, it was something. For the first time in years, we had proof, or at least the shadow of proof, that one of them might be alive. The search reignited, smaller this time, quieter, but sharper in focus. Officers drove back roads, checked motels, spoke to clerks who shook their heads, to cashiers who tried to remember faces from weeks ago. Posters went up again, fresher photos this time, digitally aged but still not quite right, because no program could really capture what time does to a person. Every ring of the phone made our hearts race. Every knock at the door sent a jolt through the house. Weeks passed, then months. Nothing. The voicemail became both our anchor and our curse. We listened to it on birthdays, on holidays, on nights when the silence grew too heavy to bear. Sometimes it felt like proof that we were right to keep hopping. Other times it felt like a cruel trick, a ghost reaching out just long enough to remind us of what we had lost. And then, one cold morning in late autumn, the call came that was different. A deputy from a small town near the edge of the mountains said they had someone in custody, a young woman found wandering near a closed rest stop, barefoot, disoriented, unable to say where she'd come from. She hadn't had any ID, barely spoke, but when they showed her missing persons photos, she had pointed to Leela's picture and whispered a name that sounded like hers. They wanted us to come. The drive felt endless, the road unwinding ahead of us through bare trees and low fog, every mile tightening the knot in my chest. In the back seat, their mother clutched a folded sweater, one of Layla, knuckles white, while their father stared straight ahead, jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. No one spoke. We were all afraid that saying anything might break whatever fragile thread was pulling us forward. At the station, they led us down a narrow hallway that smelled like old coffee and disinfectant, past doors that clicked shut behind us, until we reached a small room with a table and 3 chairs. A young officer told us to wait, his voice gentle in a way that made my stomach drop. The air felt thick, heavy, like the moment before a storm. Then the door opened. She stepped in slowly, wrapped in an oversized hoodie, her hair tangled and uneven, her face pale under the harsh light. She looked thinner than I remembered, sharper somehow, as if life had carved pieces out of her and left only the edges. Her eyes were the same, though, dark, wide, searching. For a second, no one moved. Then their mother stood, a sound tearing from her throat that was half sob, half prayer, and said Leela's name. The girl flinched. Not in recognition, in fear. She backed toward the door, shoulders hunched, eyes darting between us as if we were the ones who didn't belong. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely reached us, she said she was Leela. She said she didn't know that name. She said we had the wrong person. Their mother reached out, stopping herself just short of touching her, whispering that it was okay, that she was safe now, that she could come home. The girl shook her head harder, tears spilling down her cheeks, repeating no, 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 like a child who'd learned that word as a shield. But when her eyes met mine, something shifted. She stared at me for a long moment, her breathing quick and shallow, and then, almost against her will, she whispered my name. Just once. The room went very still. The officers exchanged glances. Their father took a step forward, his face crumpling, and said hers again, softly, like he used to when she was scared of thunderstorms. The girl's hands flew up to her ears, and she slid down the wall until she was crouched on the floor, rocking slightly, sobbing without sound, as if even crying felt dangerous. It took a long time before anyone could move. They brought in a counselor, spoke in low voices, gave her water she barely touched. Bit by bit, through nods and broken words, we learned that she remembered very little. She knew she had been somewhere dark. She knew she had not been allowed to speak. She knew she was supposed to follow rules she could not quite explain. Names, places, time, all of it was fog. But when they asked about Mara, her face went blank. She didn't know that name at all. Hope and terror twisted together inside me, so tight I could barely breathe. We had one of them back, maybe, but not the one who laughed loudest, not the one who teased and sang and filled every room with noise. And the one who stood before us now looked like a stranger wearing Leela's eyes, trembling as if the world itself were a threat. As we left the station that night, the sky already darkening, I realized that whatever had happened in those mountains had not ended when the search was called off. It had only been waiting, all these years, to walk back into our lives wearing a human face. The hospital room was too white, too bright, every surface reflecting light that made her squint and turn her face toward the wall as if even kindness could hurt. Machines hummed softly around her, a steady rhythm that filled the space where words couldn't, and for the first few hours she barely moved at all, lying on her side with her knees drawn up, hands tucked beneath her chin like she was trying to make herself small enough to disappear. A nurse spoke gently, introducing herself, explaining where she was, what day it was, but the girl only nodded, eyes wide, absorbing nothing, as if sound had to pass through layers of fear before it could reach her. They let us in one by one at first. Their mother went first, stepping slowly, like approaching a wounded animal, whispering her name even though the girl had said she didn't recognize it. She sat in the chair by the bed and talked about simple things, about the weather, about the drive, about how the porch light was still on, her voice shaking but steady, trying to build a bridge out of ordinary words. The girl listened without looking, fingers picking at the edge of the blanket, breathing shallow and fast, but she didn't tell her to leave, and that felt like something. When it was my turn, I didn't know what to say. Every sentence I had rehearsed on the drive vanished the moment I saw her like that, so small under crisp sheets, eyes ringed with shadows that no amount of rest could erase. I sat down and just said her name, softly, the way I had in that station room, and watched her shoulders tense. Then I said mine. Her eyes flicked toward me for a second, and in that brief glance I saw confusion, fear, and something else, something like recognition struggling to surface. I told her I was there, that she didn't have to answer, that it was okay to be quiet. She swallowed and nodded once, a tiny movement that felt heavier than any word. Doctors came and went, asking questions she couldn't answer, shining lights in her eyes, checking bruises and old scars that made their faces grow serious. They spoke in careful tones outside the room, words like dehydration, malnutrition, trauma, long-term confinement drifting through the door in pieces we tried not to hear. When they asked if she'd been hurt, if someone had done this to her, she stared at the ceiling and said nothing, her jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched along her cheek. It was clear that whatever she had survived lived somewhere deeper than language. The first night she didn't sleep. Every time her eyes closed, they snapped open again, her breath hitching, hands gripping the blanket like it might slide away and take her with it. A nurse sat with her for hours, speaking softly, offering water, reminding her where she was, while their mother dozed in the chair, waking at the slightest movement, reaching out to touch the girl's arm just to reassure herself that she was real. By morning, exhaustion finally won. She slept in short bursts, jerking awake every so often, eyes wild, until she recognized the room again. When she did manage to rest, her face softened in a way that broke my heart, like a child finally letting go after too long of pretending to be strong. The days that followed blurred into a strange routine. Tests, scans, questions, gentle voices, clipboards. She began to speak a little more, though never in full sentences. Yes, no, I don't know, sometimes just a shake of the head or a shrug. When someone called her Leela, she flinched, but she didn't argue anymore. It was as if she didn't have the strength to protect whatever fragile sense of self she was clinging to. One afternoon, a counselor sat with her, asking if there was any name she preferred. The girl stared at her hands for a long time, then whispered a word none of us recognized. It sounded like Myra or maybe Mira, soft and uncertain. When the counselor repeated it back, the girl nodded, relief flickering across her face like she had finally been given permission to exist. From then on, the staff used that name, and she seemed to relax just a little, as if being called something chosen, even half-remembered, made the world less threatening. They told us that memory loss was common in cases like hers, that the mind sometimes hides what it cannot bear, that fragments might return slowly or not at all. They warned us not to push, not to demand answers, not to expect gratitude or recognition. Healing, they said, was not a straight line. It was a maze. Still, every quiet moment we hoped she would suddenly look up and say our names with certainty, laugh the way Leela used to, ask where Mara was. We waited for the miracle of recognition, even as we tried to prepare ourselves for the truth that it might never come. It was a nurse who first noticed the scars. They were faint, old, almost hidden along her wrists and ankles, pale lines that circled the skin like ghostly bracelets. When asked about them, the girl stiffened, pulling the blanket tighter, eyes darting to the door as if someone might walk in at any moment. She whispered that she wasn't supposed to talk about that it wasn't allowed, and no matter how gently they pressed, she shut down completely, curling into herself until they backed off. After that, security was tightened, doors locked, names on visitor lists. The world outside the room felt suddenly dangerous again, as if whatever had held her for so long might reach out and try to take her back. At night, when the hallway lights dimmed and the hospital grew quiet, she sometimes made small sounds in her sleep, barely audible whimpers that made their mother rise from her chair and lean over the bed, stroking her hair, whispering that she was safe, that no one was coming, that she was here. I watched those moments from the doorway, feeling like an intruder on something sacred and fragile, afraid that even my presence might break it. A week passed, then another. She gained a little strength, managed to sit up on her own, even took a few steps with a therapist holding her elbow, her legs shaking like they didn't quite remember how to be legs. She ate slowly, cautiously, as if expecting the food to disappear if she wasn't careful, thanking the nurses in a voice so soft it was almost lost in the hum of machines. And then, one quiet afternoon, when rain traced thin lines down the window, and the room smelled faintly of antiseptic and wet pavement, she did something that changed everything. I was sitting by her bed, flipping through a magazine I wasn't really reading, while she watched the drops race each other on the glass. Without looking at me, she asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, if I knew a song about fireflies. My heart skipped. It was a silly little tune Mara used to hum on camping trips, making up words as she went, teasing Leela until she laughed and tried to sing louder. No one else knew it. It wasn't on the radio. It was theirs. I told her I did. She closed her eyes, her brow furrowing, as if reaching for something just out of grasp, and asked me to sing it. My voice shook as I began, the simple melody filling the room, carrying with it 1,000 memories of nights under open skies, of laughter and warmth and being whole. As I sang, tears slid down her cheeks, silent and steady, and when I reached the end, she whispered that someone used to sing that to her in the dark, that it made the dark feel smaller. I asked her who. She shook her head, confused, frustrated, pressing her fingers to her temples like she could squeeze the answer out. Then she looked at me, eyes wide and wet, and said she thought it was her sister. The word hung in the air between us, fragile and powerful. I didn't ask which one. I didn't need to. In that moment, I knew that somewhere beneath the fear and the fog, beneath the scars and the silence, Leela was still there, fighting her way back, one memory at a time, even if the path was long and twisted and painful beyond anything we could imagine. The day they finally let her leave the hospital, the sky was low and grey, the kind that presses down on everything, making the world feel smaller than it really is. She stood by the window in borrowed clothes, a sweater too big for her thin frame, watching rain bead and slide across the glass, and when the nurse told her it was time, she didn't move right away. It was as if stepping outside meant crossing an invisible line she wasn't sure she was allowed to cross. Their mother took her hand, warm and steady, and only then did she nod, letting herself be guided toward the door. The hallway felt endless. Every footstep echoed. Every passing stranger made her flinch, drawing closer, her fingers tightening around her mother's sleeve like a child afraid of getting lost in a crowd. I walked on her other side, close enough that our shoulders almost touched, ready to catch her if her legs gave out again. She kept her eyes down, counting tiles, breathing in short, careful pulls, until the automatic doors slid open and cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and wet asphalt. She froze. For a second, I thought she might bolt back inside, but then she lifted her face and let the rain mist touch her skin. Her eyes widened, not in fear this time, but in something like wonder, as if she had forgotten that the world could feel like this, sharp and alive and real. She tilted her head, listening to the distant hiss of tires, the soft drumming on metal, and a small sound escaped her, halfway between a laugh and a sob. Their mother squeezed her hand, tears streaming freely now, whispering that it was okay, that she was really here, that the sky was still the same sky. The drive home was quiet. She sat in the back seat, staring out the window, watching houses pass, trees bending in the wind, street signs blurring by. Every so often she would glance at her reflection in the glass, touching her cheek or her collarbone as if checking that she was solid, that she wasn't about to fade. When we crossed the bridge over the river, she leaned forward, peering down at the dark water, and asked in a small voice if it ever stopped moving. I told her it didn't. That even when it looks calm, it's always going somewhere. She nodded, thinking about that, and settled back again. Our house looked the same as it always had, white siding, blue door, the old oak tree in the yard shedding wet leaves onto the grass. But to her, it might as well have been a foreign country. She stood on the porch, staring at the door like it might bite, her breath shallow, eyes darting to every corner. Their mother unlocked it slowly, giving her time, and when the door finally opened, the familiar smell of home drifted out, coffee and soap, and something warm from the kitchen that had been waiting since morning. She stepped inside like she was entering a church. Every room held a ghost. The couch where Mara used to sprawl with her books. The hallway where Leela once practiced cartwheels until she crashed into the wall and laughed so hard she couldn't stand. The kitchen table with one chair that had been empty for 6 years. She moved from space to space, touching things lightly, tracing the edge of a picture frame, brushing her fingers over the back of a chair, her face a mix of curiosity and quiet grief, like she could feel the memories even if she couldn't fully see them. Her room had been kept almost exactly the same. Their mother had dusted it every week, aired it out, refused to let anything be moved, as if freezing it in time might somehow bring them back. When she stood in the doorway and saw it, her breath caught. The bed with the faded quilt, the shelf with old trophies, the corkboard with photos of smiling faces from a life that felt impossibly far away. She walked in slowly and sat on the edge of the bed, pressing her hand into the blanket, testing its softness, then lay down on her side, curling up just like she had in the hospital, eyes fixed on the wall. That night, none of us really slept. She woke at every sound, the creak of the house settling, the hum of the refrigerator, a car passing outside. Each time their mother was there, sitting on the floor beside the bed, whispering that she was home, that no one was going to take her, that the doors were locked and the lights were on and she was safe. I lay awake in my room, listening through the thin walls, feeling both relief and a strange, heavy fear, like we had brought something fragile into a place full of sharp edges. The days that followed were slow and careful, a new routine built around her needs. Breakfast at the same time every morning, short walks around the block with one of us always beside her, therapy appointments that left her drained and silent for hours afterward. She learned where things were, how to pour herself water, how to open the back door and step into the yard without panicking. Each small act felt like a victory. But the past refused to stay buried. Sometimes, in the middle of a normal moment, she would go still, her eyes glazing over, her body tensing as if bracing for something unseen. Once, when a neighbor's dog barked suddenly, she dropped to the floor, covering her head, whispering apologies to no one in particular. It took us minutes to convince her to stand up again, to remind her that she hadn't done anything wrong, that there was no punishment coming. Afterward, she sat at the kitchen table, shaking, tears dripping onto the wood, asking over and over what she had done, what she had forgotten, what rules she had broken. We had no answers. At night the dreams came. She would cry out, thrashing, her voice hoarse with fear, words tumbling out that made no sense to us, fragments about doors and dark and not enough time. Their mother would climb into bed beside her, holding her until the shaking stopped, even when her own arms ached, even when her eyes burned with exhaustion. In the morning, she never remembered the dreams, only the soreness in her throat and the tired heaviness behind her eyes. And then there was the guilt. It settled over her like a shadow. She apologized for everything, for taking too long to eat, for needing help in the shower, for asking the same question again, for being tired, for being scared, for being here. No matter how many times we told her she had nothing to be sorry for, she kept saying it, like a reflex she couldn't unlearn. One afternoon, as rain pattered softly against the windows, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring into the steam. Without looking up, she asked what had happened to Mara. The room went very quiet. Their mother's hands tightened around the dish towel she was holding. I felt my chest constrict, the old ache flaring up, sharp and familiar. We had talked around it for days, answering questions about school, about neighbors, about little things, but we had avoided this one, afraid of what it might do to her. I told her the truth. That Mara had never come back, that searches had gone on for months, that people had brought casseroles and whispered in low voices, that eventually they had stopped calling her missing and started calling her gone. I didn't say dead, none of us ever did, but she understood. She nodded slowly, absorbing it, her face pale. For a long time she said nothing. Then she whispered that she was supposed to protect her, that she had promised, on the trail, to stay close, to not wander off, that she must have failed. Their mother rushed to her side, dropping to her knees, taking her face in her hands, telling her it wasn't her fault, that none of it was, that she had been just a child. But she shook her head, tears spilling over, saying that promises mattered, that she should have done more, that maybe if she had been stronger, smarter, braver, Mara would still be here. It was the first time we saw her cry like that, not quietly, not in small silent tears, but in deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body, the kind that come from a place so hurt there are no words left. We held her between us on the kitchen floor, the three of us clinging together, letting her grief pour out until it left her exhausted and limp in our arms. After that, something shifted. She didn't stop being afraid. She didn't stop waking from nightmares or flinching at sudden sounds. But she began to talk more, about flashes of memory that came without warning, a smell that made her nauseous, a sound that made her heart race, a dark room that felt both familiar and distant. She couldn't put the pieces together, but she was trying, and that felt like movement, like the river I had told her about, always going somewhere, even when you can't see where it leads. One evening, just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks, she stood at the front window, watching the light fade. She asked if we could go back to the mountains someday. Their mother froze, fear flashing across her face, but the girl kept talking, saying she didn't mean now or soon, just someday when she was stronger, when she could stand there again and not be afraid. She said she wanted to remember the good parts, the wind in the trees, the way the trail smelled after rain, the sound of Mara laughing when she slipped on a rock and pretended it was on purpose. I told her maybe, that we would see. She smiled faintly, leaning her forehead against the glass, watching the last of the light disappear. And in that moment, for the first time since she had walked out of the woods and back into our lives, she looked less like someone who had been rescued and more like someone who might, one day, learn how to live again. The dawn came pale and thin, sliding over the Smoky Mountains like a whispered apology, and I stood at the edge of the clearing with the smell of wet pine in my lungs, feeling the weight of everything finally settle into my bones. The night had burned itself out in confession and tears, in words I had carried alone for 6 years, and now there was nothing left to hide behind, no shadow deep enough to keep the truth from breathing. The world looked the same as it always had, the ridgelines fading into mist, the trees murmuring in the wind, but inside me something had cracked open, raw and aching, and strangely light at the same time. They had found the place before sunrise, the narrow ravine where the earth dipped and the rocks formed a crude shelter, where I had led them with shaking hands and eyes that refused to look away. I watched from a distance as the search team moved carefully, their flashlights cutting through the last of the dark, and when they uncovered what remained, there was no shock left in me, only a hollow quiet that felt like the end of a long-held breath. I didn't go closer. I didn't need to. I had carried that sight with me every night since the moment I ran, since the moment fear made me choose my own heartbeat over my sister's fading one. People spoke in low voices behind me, words like closure and answers and healing, but none of them knew what it felt like to be the one who left, to live every day with the sound of a voice calling your name in the dark, to wake up soaked in sweat, because in your dreams she is still there, reaching, asking why. I closed my eyes and saw her as she had been before the mountains swallowed us, laughing with her head thrown back, teasing me for being too cautious, too afraid to live loud, and the memory cut deeper than anything the night had brought. When I turned, he was there, standing a few steps away, my father looking older than I remembered, his shoulders bent as if the years had pressed him down inch by inch. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, really looked, as if trying to match the woman in front of him with the girl who had vanished and then come back wrong. I waited for anger, for the words I knew I deserved, but what I saw in his eyes was something softer and more devastating, a grief that had learned to live with itself and now didn't know what to do with the truth. "I thought I lost both of you," he said finally, his voice rough, and in that moment something inside me gave way. I stepped toward him, then stopped, unsure if I had the right, but he closed the distance and wrapped his arms around me, holding on like he might fall apart if he didn't. I cried into his jacket, the smell of smoke and cold and home filling my senses, and for the first time in 6 years, I let myself be held without flinching, without running. The sun climbed higher, burning off the mist, and with it came the quiet understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. There would be questions, investigations, stories told and retold until they lost their edges, but beneath all of it would remain the simple, unbearable truth that one sister came back and the other did not, and that the space between those facts was filled with choices that could never be undone. I would live with that. I had already been living with it. Now I would just do it in the light. Later, when most of the people had gone, I walked alone to the edge of the trail where the trees thickened and the ground sloped down toward the ravine. I knelt and pressed my palm to the cold earth, feeling its dampness seep into my skin, and I whispered her name, not like a plea this time, but like a promise. I told her I was sorry, that I was afraid, that I had been so young and so small in the face of that endless dark, and that I had carried her with me every step of the way, even when I pretended I hadn't. The wind moved through the branches above, making the leaves shiver, and for a moment it almost sounded like a reply. I didn't know if forgiveness was something I could ever earn, but I stayed there anyway, breathing in the scent of moss and pine and rain, letting the mountains hear me at last. They had kept our secret for so long, wrapped it in fog and silence, and now they were giving it back, not gently, but honestly. When I stood, my legs trembled, but I felt steadier than I had in years. I turned toward the path that led back to the waiting world, to the faces that would look at me with pity or blame or both, and I knew it wouldn't be easy, that some nights the dark would still come for me, but I also knew I would not run anymore. The mountains had taken enough from us. They would not take the rest of my life too. As I walked away, the light filtered through the trees, catching on the drifting mist and turning it gold. And in that quiet glow I imagined her walking beside me, not as she was at the end, broken and afraid, but as she had been at the start, strong and bright and teasing me to keep up. And I carried that image with me, step by step, until the trail curved and the forest closed in behind, leaving only the echo of 2 sets of footsteps fading into the heart of the Smokies.